Hello there, everyone. I bet you thought I was going to come from the right, or whatever this direction is. I don't remember. I always come from that area, and so to me, it's to my right. So I bet you thought I was going to come from the left, but not today. Today we're doing something different. We're actually not. It's just another episode of a new thing. Happy to be here with all of you again. Stuff's going on downstairs, so I'm up here. I wrote the name of the show in the back. You can barely see it because it's blown out on the whiteboard because of the light, but that's fine. Welcome to a new thing. I'm excited to be here with all of you. We're going to continue our going through the difficult sayings of Jesus. And today I wanted to talk about one that maybe is a little bit different, but I want to talk about why it's important. And there's someone who has wonderfully, well, not only why it's important, but also how it's ultimately fulfilled in something else that happened. So let's talk about that because someone done goofed. So this is our difficult phrase from Jesus, and it might not appear so on the surface, right? This is a famous passage where Jesus sends out the 12 disciples, and he sends them out to go, well, we're going to see what he sends them out to do. So I'm just going to read the first 8 verses here. Matthew 10. Not Jesus said, but this is what Matthew writes. He said, Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, his brother Andrew, James the son of Zebedee and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. So Jesus sends them out, right? And what does he send them out to do? Well, interestingly, he tells them to do something that we would not normally associate with Jesus saying, I don't think. Because his first instruction is, do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. It's kind of a curious thing to say, right? Jesus usually doesn't tell us to do that, right? He seems to take a very open view towards Gentiles and Samaritans. In fact, let's just contrast this kind of with what Jesus says at the very end of the Gospel of Matthew, right? Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. So right there, it seems like there's an exact opposite command from what Jesus says here, when he says, do not go to the Gentiles or to the Samaritans. Now, what's going on here? He says instead to go to the lost sheep of Israel. Now, I think for many of us, right, we might hear this and we may get offended. And I think that maybe not offended because of the racial or ethnic tensions that are kind of under this passage, but we might be like, why doesn't Jesus just send them to everywhere? Why does he focus on this one group of people? Well, what's interesting is what Jesus kind of, and what the apostles later see the mission of theirs being. So you have to remember that the way that the early church spread was they would go firstly, to synagogues. And they would go and they would proclaim that Jesus was the Messiah. And it would only be after they would be kicked out that they would then go to the Gentiles in the area. This is what Paul does. And so this is a very common practice. It seems that many of the other disciples probably did something like this, although it seems like Paul in particular was tasked with going to the Gentiles. But all that's being said, right? What Jesus says here is he makes a category distinction of these people need it first, and that's the Jews, right? Go to the lost sheep of Israel. So these are all of the people of Israel who are, so this would be the Jews, who do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah, go to them and tell them who he is. Now, I actually think today this causes another bit of tension, which is that I think a lot of Christians don't really like doing outreach to Jews. And I think a lot of that has to do with recent historical events, so I can understand why. But I think also there's this idea that without this, right, they have to be brought in to the fold. And so I think there's a lot of, the way that I think this was challenging for the church before was Gentiles saw themselves as being the supreme, ultimate children of the Lord, because God has kind of not exchanged, but has grafted them on into Israel, and therefore they're the new Israel, which I think is how the New Testament teaches. But that doesn't mean that Jewish Christians are then cut out, and it certainly doesn't mean that we don't stop trying to evangelize to Jews, which has its own kind of difficulties and problems these days. But regardless, right, difficult thing to do. But why? What does this fulfill? Well, this fulfills Christ's mission for the whole of creation, right? His job as the Messiah is to come first to the Jewish people, to call them to repentance, and then go to the nations. And I think this is actually something that really separates Christ from other figures. And I think one of the things that's important is that Jesus wasn't just the only divine person, and I don't mean that in any like literal sense. Obviously, Jesus has been the only divine person, right? He's God. But what I mean by that, he wasn't the only person in the ancient world who claimed divinity. So I want to look at this stupid tweet that I read earlier, but I actually think it does a good job of summing up how our culture is kind of regressing, unfortunately, but also the positive parts of like what this message of Jesus being the Messiah and being God, going to the Jews first, is for us, even if we might not like it. So this is what some e-girl said. For those of you who don't know, e-girl is like a term for women online who usually write articles and things in order to get the male gaze. That's usually what that refers to. And usually they play up sexuality and things like that. That's not here, but just wanted to define my term. So this is, and again, like, this is what this girl says, right? This woman. She says, the West is defined by two men who claim divinity: Jesus Christ and Alexander the Great, whom Caesar modeled himself after. And you can see down here, you can see a picture of them both, right? Famous icon of Christ from Sinai, the Sinai monastery. And then there's this famous, if you know ancient art, which I do, very famous mosaic of Alexander the Great fighting the Persians there. It's very, very well done. Anyway, Alexander the Great. Many ask, what would Jesus do? Only Napoleon asked, what would Alexander do? Fewer ask, what did Jesus leave to his friends and family? Now, this is pretty interesting, right? Now, you can see that this is a right-wing thing. Again, this isn't me attacking the right wing. I think that this is, you have equal problems or different problems on the left wing. But this is where you can kind of see this attempt to regress. It takes place on both sides of the spectrum, and this is how it usually forms itself on the right wing in the way that I viewed it. Because it's so interesting. It's like, why did Jesus leave his friends and family? Kind of an interesting way of phrasing that. So many will object, but in an age of DEI stands for diversity, equity, inclusion. So I'm sure if any of you in corporate work, you know exactly what that means. And mass immigration. The idea that we can look at Alexander and call him a bloodthirsty conqueror, or look at Christ and judge him a sensitive prophet of peace and the brotherhood of man, is turned on its head when you, and she repeats herself, but that's okay, when you remember Christ's followers weeping and scattered, his mother left with nothing at Golgotha, and his followers destined for horrible, torturous ends, whilst Alexander left his followers and family kings and queens several times over. When I see millions of migrants welcomed in and giving accommodations ahead of struggling natives, or when I see 6% of all Fortune 100 jobs went to whites in 2022 compared to a base rate of 60% of the population, I feel vastly more sympathetic to the sacker of Thebes and Tyre and considerably less esteem for the profit of peace and charity. I think it's interesting, right? Because this actually doesn't argue. I mean, I guess I don't really. The weird thing about this, right, is it's arguing in the favor of nativism, right? This idea that like what matters most is blood. This is very popular rhetoric on like right wing circles, right? The way that the way that that on far left circles, you'll have people abolish the family. They'll say stuff like that, right? They're basically polar opposites of each other. One denigrates it so much, the other one exalts it so much. And of course, one of the natural ways you do this is you look at the nation as one big family. And you can do this positively and negatively, right? I don't want to just say, oh, the Nazis did it, therefore it's wrong. Like, no, like there have been good examples of this happening too. It's just interesting, though, because it's not exactly the way Alexander would have seen things. As someone who is quite a fan of this period of history, it's always odd to see this type of stuff like mass immigration and DEI. It's taking things that are from the past and doing it over. And so basically what she's saying, right, is she's saying that Christ didn't leave anything his family and friends. I'm anything for his family and friends, while Alexander did, right? That Christ is weak. He dies. His disciples leave. His mother's left with nothing. His followers die torturous ends. I think it's funny that she leaves out kind of like the most important thing that Christians claim, which is that Christ rose from the dead, right? Alexander is still in his grave. I don't have it with me. I should have brought it up here. I wasn't thinking about it. But in my office, in other videos, you can see that there's an icon over on the left to me. Maybe I've talked about it before on the channel. I don't know. But it's over there, and it's a depiction of a monk, Egyptian monk named Saint Sisos. And he's at the grave of Alexander the Great. He's at his tomb, and he's weeping over him. And it's funny because it shows Alexander's bones, right? And it's interesting to read in front of this because it's a marked contrast, right? Alexander is dead. Christ is alive. It's just kind of, and again, I have no like hatred for Alexander the Great. Militarily incredibly impressive, right? But I would also say that the way that she reads this, I mean, Alexander's empire fell apart immediately. And really, I would say only one, maybe two of the kingdoms that popped up after were long lasting. But I think what it shows, right, is that people are willing to take these two ways of viewing the world, right? The way of Christ and basically the way of the world, which is power. Alexander the Great's an example of that, but anyone can be an example of that because it's the opposite. So it's this idea that we are able to. I just realized I wasn't even showing you guys the internet thing. My goodness, I apologize for that. Gosh, we got so far in, I didn't even show. This is what it looks like. Sorry, I totally had no idea that I was doing that. This is what happens when you do it live, right? Sometimes you forget to hit things. And so you can see here, right, that there's Alexander the Great and Jesus. And anyway, so you have two ways of viewing the world, right? You have the way of Christ, you have the way of Alexander the Great. And I think in this message, right, we see a repudiation, even though on the surface it seems like it might agree with this girl, that all that matters is blood and family and strength, right? But instead, here's what Christ says. He says, in a way that maybe she would approve of, don't go to these other people, right? Don't go to the Gentiles. Don't go to the Samaritans. And he's not saying that because he's racist or whatever, like maybe some other people would be. But instead, what he's saying is, I have a mission to fulfill. So go gather the lost sheep of Israel. And then he does this all for free, by the way, right? He tells them they aren't to take any money for this, or for any of the good things that they're doing. And then, of course, we see where this ends, right? So, again, Jesus says this in one way, but it has a purpose and has this mission of uniting the world. The way Alexander tried to unite the world was through conquest, and he did a pretty good job. I mean, let me see. We'll see how my internet's up here is doing. But he went all the way from what is now Greece, through Turkey, down into Egypt, all the way to the east, and basically stopped at India. Let me see if I can pull up a picture. The internet up here is a little tricky. But here's the point, right? The point is that that's the way Alexander conquered the world. The way that Christ conquered the world was through expanding that mission, right? It starts one area, fulfills the messianic promise, but then goes, and it's not, guess what? Good news, it's not only for these guys, it's for everyone else too. So, I mean, that wasn't very helpful. Encyclopedia Britannica, you opened up only a slightly bigger picture. There we go. So this is the conquest. See, he goes down, he goes into Egypt, out, conquers the Persian Empire, which was huge, and gets to India, gets to the Indus River, fights a battle with an Indian ruler, and then basically what happens then is his troops are going to mutiny, and so he goes back. He goes to Persepolis, and then he dies there of either poisoning or alcohol poisoning or a fever or something. People don't really know. Point is that that's one way you can conquer the world. Or you can conquer the world in the much more impactful, long-lasting, eternal way, which is the way that Christ did it through the cross, and the way that he tells us to go out and do it through the Great Commission. Right? Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. That's how Christ conquered the world. And I think that it's so challenging to many of us because it's not the way that we view it, because we view it coming through power or through ethnicity or through conquest or whatever. But that's not how Christ did it. So thank you, everyone. Sorry about the video part where I didn't show you guys. Hopefully I made up for it at the end when I showed you the pictures and stuff like that. But anyway, I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. I will see you guys next on Sunday for worship, and then of course next week for Bible studies and all that good stuff. So peace out.